Well, I'm Frank Beaty, and just to let you know a little bit, the walker and the wheelchair are for me. Back in February, I fell, slipped on the ice, and whacked my head. For a month, they thought it was nothing serious, and then they took another brain scan and said, "Oh, we got a problem." And so, get off your medicines. So I had 2 weeks to get off of my vitamins and so forth. And I had surgery on March 25. They thought that simple procedure of doing a brain catheterization. They go up your groin and go up to your brain, not your heart. And they somehow stop any leaking. That's what they called it. And then, so
That was Tuesday.
that was on Tuesday. They thought that would work, and they didn't. They found that out very quickly, and very quickly, unbelievably quick. They set up surgery for Friday, and so people changed schedules and this, that, and the other. Anyway, then on Friday they drilled 2 holes in my head, so I do have a hole in my head, and stuck in drain pipes, the little plastic tube, to drain off the fluid that was on my brain. Had little plastic bottles on my side that you can see the reddish stuff coming out. So that was kind of interesting. But that surgery really knocked my legs out. I can walk, so that's the reason I have a walker. But anyway.
But it's a long ways to this room, as you all found out.
I serve with Interim Pastor Ministries. This is my wife, Judy. As of today, we are both 82.
Hey, happy birthday. Does that mean one of your birthdays is today?
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Amazing. Good for you.
Take your wife to church conference.
Push you around in a wheelchair.
Yeah, not a present today.
I do it again. That's fine.
So anyway, we've been in partners for ministry for 60 years, almost 61. I retired from active pastor ministry in 2008 and affiliated with Interim Pastor Ministries. Part of the reason that I did that was it was an opportunity for me to use my gifts, my training, my passion, my desire to serve the Lord in my later years. As you well know, very few churches are looking for a 50-year-old, let alone a 65-year-old pastor. It has been a very, very rewarding experience for me, but it has increased my conviction for the need of churches to have somebody who serves as a
Just got out of high school last year, did you?
That's right.
I served 2 churches that I was an unintentional interim, where I served, but in a few months I basically was done, even though I stayed longer, because there was unresolved issues with the former pastor that I fell into, and
Not as an interim. This was before you were an interim.
this was when I was a permanent pastor, that I fell into those, and I became a short-term pastor. So, anyway, one of the things that I'm probably not going to keep track here to where we're at, but I really am convinced that the interim time can be such a valuable time for a church to learn, to grow, and to develop. It's a time that a church and its leaders can pause and think and evaluate. I like to work with a leadership team in a church to help them clarify why they're there. Stabilizing is, okay, pastoral, okay. I think those are pretty descriptive of how congregants feel when the pastor says, I'm resigning as of 2 weeks from today, or 2 months from today. What are we going to do? How can we move forward? Upset, yeah. Some people are very angry, and some people quietly clap their hands. Sad. But common obstacles that they face, and you men who are pastors, have been pastors, realize these kind of things as you went into a church or as you were leaving a church. They lost their vision. They didn't have the leadership that they needed. They were focused mostly on what can the church do for me, not for what we can do for others. A resistance to change, spiritual lethargy, power and control issues. Today I'm coaching pastors, and one of the guys at the coach told me last Wednesday, he said, well, in the church he had been before this church, so-and-so is gone, which was an asset to the church. But when he was there, he was a power broker and knew how to control things, pull strings behind the back. Little disciple making, ineffective structure. One of the churches I served had roots in the Methodist Church. It was in New England and Vermont. And in the 20s, when there was a lack of pastors, there were a lot of churches in New England that had at least 2 churches in town that combined, and one man served one. In this situation, the church was in the congregational building, and the pastor was in the Methodist parsonage. But they had gotten rid of those, but the structure was still there. So, I mean, they had committees coming out in their ears, and as an interim pastor, I could guide them to change that structure to be more effective and to lead them forward. But it was that was a traditionalism, aging, yeah. So the first church I ever served I was 19 when I started, and I went there on weekends, and we really had a crowd if we got up to 25, but they were all old folks except me, and I don't know if they were 65 or what. They're all gone now, so I can't go back and ask them how old were you in 1962. But anyway, that's where it is. As I work with a church, I like to ask the question, use this as John Maxwell's statement, everything rises and falls on leadership, and to help leaders see the privilege, but also the need for training in that. And then I held my finger on it. So, this is a time to develop leaders. One of the blessings I find of being an interim is there are things that I can do that a permanent pastor cannot do, because I have no money in the game. That's just value. But two of the guys I'm coaching now are in the process of developing leaders. One of them is using the book Beating Leaders by Aubrey Malfors, and the other one is using Simple Church. That's from, can't think of the guy's name. Anyway, it's a very opportune time to develop leaders and to help that happen. So, soar into their God-given future. This is a question I'd like to ask leadership in the church. What would you like to see happen this year in your church and this decade? The decade adds a whole new dynamic to the question, but then I'd like to come back and change the question. What would Jesus like to see happen in his church this year and this decade? And it raises the whole issue of saying, this church is not my church, it's his church. And again, I have freedom as an interim to raise that question, that a permanent pastor would not have that much freedom to do that, or at least in some situations. So that's part of my passion as it relates to church pastor. Another thing, as it relates from the leadership standpoint, not the pastor standpoint, the whole process of calling a pastor. Too many times in American culture, one of my sons and I have run this back and forth a lot of times, that a pastor is too often chosen by his personality or his wife's ability to play the piano.
Not mine.
You know, rather than what do we need, what kind of person. And the propensity is, if a guy, the former pastor, was very evangelistic, they want to get somebody who's more Bible emphasis. If he's good with youth, they say, well, we need to get somebody who's good with senior citizens. Very reactionary. And that's unfortunate. If I were to ask you guys, where would you go right now if you needed to call the pastor? I don't know what your answer would be, but I know my answer off the top of my head. I can tell you half a dozen solutions. They may not work for your church, but they are positive solution places that have evangelical pastors available that you can contact. But we use a number of different things to help a congregation have input into the kind of pastor that they feel, the individual feels they need in the church at that point in time. And it's a simple document, but it's a very helpful document that the average church doesn't have access to such things, and they are out there headhunting, not sure what they're looking for. And then you walk into that as a pastor, and they may find out that they got more than what they wanted, which causes problems. So that's one thing. Okay, mission, vision, values. We work with the leadership to develop what their mission is, which is really the Great Commission. But then, how does that apply in our community, and how do we work on it? What is it that we value? Those are important statements to have clarity, because then when we have those clarity, then when we look for a pastor, we can determine, does he line up with what we're looking for? Or is he wanting us to do something different that just is not us? That makes sense? But yeah, I can remember as a young kid, a long-term pastor had left, and why I remember this, I don't know, but I remember somebody in one of the meetings saying, well, when the pastor comes, he can tell us what our vision is.
Oh, yeah.
That may align with the congregation, it may not, but it's a reality. So, when we think of this, we want to think of disciple making, developing leaders. How can we innovate without upsetting the fruit basket? So those are some of the things that we do with purpose and skill. I was thinking about this, I don't know, yesterday or sometime this week, that there are problems within a church that you who are pastors would say, that's a tough issue, but I think I can help the church work through it. But at the same time, if a young guy just coming out of school goes into that, he would be snowballed, just be in over his head. And one church I pastored, I never met the man, but he was so snowballed he left the ministry, even though he was a very talented guy. Overwhelmed, just did not know how to deal with some of the problems that the church had. So that's another part of that. That is crucial. We have guys who are passionate, proactive, personable. This is about the plane that hit into the bunch of birds.
Yeah, so-
It landed in the river. There's the date of it. This last statement, I think, is so relevant to pastoral ministry. Anxiety filled the cockpit and the passengers, much like the anxiety that fills a church when a pastor leaves. But you know, the pilot didn't know what to do, but he did. What if the pilot in control of the U.S. Airways was less than Sully's Sullenberger? I mean, he had skill, he had knowledge, he had insight, even though he probably had never had a minute of training. What if you have to land on water? What if it's his first time as a captain of an airplane? What if landing on the Hudson was a crazy idea to him? Well, it may have been crazy, but everybody survived. That's the positive of it. Churches and pastoral tradition need the Sullenbergers of the life, evangelical pastoral world, often the gray-haired, or maybe bald, with experience who have been flying in the planes for decades. I remember one of the churches I served as an interim, I said to the leadership board, at I think my first meeting, I said, look, one of the goals that I have is to bring peace to the congregation. They had a very troubled man who I followed. Had only been there like 13 months. And I said that I wanted to bring peace. And one of the guys basically interrupted me and said, the moment you stepped into the pulpit, I felt peace. That's one of the advantages of the age. And, so we have seasoned, skilled, and strategic pastors to help congregations, and now or in the future seize the opportunity used today to prepare Jesus' church for what He wants for tomorrow. Well, there's my contact information. Don't go through a pastoral transition alone. And then I'll be more direct to those of you who are pastors and approaching retirement age. It's true, I said I was 82, that's right. But there's so many needs. One of the leading sources of pastoral placement is the name left my head. Anyway, the study that they made is that in the next 3 years, 1, 2, 3, there's going to be more pastors retire than any other short-term era of people reaching 65 years of age. So there's a great need, and IPM offers the opportunity for you to use your passions, your experiences, positive and negative, your knowledge, your education, for many years. And so I really strongly urge you not to quit and basically put your passions and your training and your experiences on the shelf and say, forget it, I'm going to play golf. I've prayed for a lot of guys to hit 70 on their first day out in retirement. We have a friend in our small group that he retired and was going to play golf, and he did that for about a year. Then he changed his mind. It's so meaningless, so empty. So, that's what I have to say. I'm open to questions.
You mentioned at least one, maybe two instances where you went into a church that was clearly in crisis, just went from pastor to pastor. And I think what I picked up over the years and what I'm hearing you saying is that sometimes the function of the interim is, it's like the bug man. You got to come in and kind of clean up the problem.
Yeah.
And because otherwise, if you go from pastor right to another full-time pastor, many times that first guy in after a crisis is martyred.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And those guys that get martyred, and maybe we all do at some point, that's another piece that comes into, well, maybe I should just leave ministry.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't want to go through this again. I don't want to put my family through this.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So what I'm understanding, and from other experiences talking with interims, is that it's an essential piece to the healing of the congregation before they call their new pastor.
Yep.
Gives him a chance,
Exactly.
or her.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you lived that though.
Oh yeah, I lived that.
On both sides of it, both sides of the.
As a pastor and as an
pastor.
interim. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes a congregation is ready for sometimes are resistant, but that's in God's hands. I need to be sure I don't blow it. But in all the churches that I served as an interim, the attendance grew. But you know, it's like the guy that said, when you step in the pulpit, I felt peace. And people do not like conflict. But when people see that something's being done to address the conflict in a healthy manner, that's attractive. So, and it's attractive to a new pastor candidate. Yeah.
Another observation, and it goes back when I was in 5th and 6th grade. I worked at an orchard, and we would take completely good-looking plants and cut them back.
Yeah.
Trees, cut them back, and it was the art of pruning. So you're actually going backwards for a moment, but you prune in the correct way, and that plant grows in its 2nd and 3rd and 4th year and becomes prosperous.
Yeah.
And I've used that as kind of a metaphor in ministries. Sometimes when you go in, there's a great deal of pruning that needs to take place so that you can get healthy again. And,
You know, the guy that's using simple church to disciple the leadership team, they have too much going on. And so they're doing many things, but none with excellence. So that's exactly what you're saying.
And sometimes, just the thing that you mentioned about the church isn't ready, one of the guys he's coaching right now has had, I don't know, what was it, 7 pastors in the last
20 years.
But anyway, they have been unwilling to deal with some issues. Now this time, this interim is finally getting through to some of those root causes, and hopefully the church is going to be way better when he gets done, before they call the next pastor.
Yeah.
But they've had several interims, and they've had, but they weren't willing to listen. One of those power brokers in the church was still trying to control things, and I think now he's finally listening. Another one we were in, there was an elephant under the carpet. Oh my goodness, people could see it, but nobody wanted to have anything to do with it. Well, he lashed out at me, and so I took the brunt of that. But it wasn't his plan. He sent out an email, and he sent it to me as well as our leadership team instead of just Frank. But anyway, that was the turning point in that church, and today that church is growing and very healthy. But it took that oops to have that happen. So,
Yeah.
in your experience, much of this can be boiled down to difficult personality or personalities.
Yeah.
That kind of just take over. Is that what you found?
That's oftentimes true. Yeah.
I used to mentor some younger pastors, and I said, you can get upset at the church and move on down the road.
But they're there.
But the same personality types there too. You've got to learn to deal with these in a way that's productive for them and you.
Yeah.
Because you keep chasing it. You say, I'm going to find another church. I'll be happy there. And they're there.
Yeah.
Same thing I tell you the congregation,
Yeah.
as well as the pastor, that it's not, all churches are going to have some type of situation. But I look at it like a family.
That's right.
You know, you have problems in your own family, so the church is supposed to be a family. So you have to work through those, so if you just go to hopping around, you're gonna find something that you're not gonna be satisfied with, so why don't you look inward?
It's the things that we're passionate about that we argue about. And I'm glad that people are passionate about faith, but then that's what brings out some of the heated arguments as well.
I'd like to speak to just a minute from the wife's perspective. Most of our, well, I don't know, but we have found it where the wife goes with, some of the interim pastors, the wife is still working, and that's where their insurance comes from, or that kind of thing.
Sure.
Or she is unwilling to go with him. But I loved it. But not every wife can, you know. I'm not married to my great Aunt Susie's beautiful whatever to take with me, or that kind of thing. No, Frank always made sure that we took a Christmas tree with us, or that we had ability for some of those things, or some plants, that kind of thing. But not, you know, I can get along with people somebody give me this couch to use, and somebody else this table, or this kind of thing. And we have chosen to make do with it, and chosen to pour ourselves into the community when we're there. Some wives can't do that. However, we have found, I think without exception, that the couples where the wife goes with the husband, it's a really, for most of those situations, it's a breath of fresh air to those churches. Many of the churches, you know, if the husband is already going through some trauma himself, the wife is too, some of those. And so to have an interim wife, pastor's wife, come along and just stand with the women. You know, I did teach a Bible study in one of the churches, but I didn't take over any leadership of anything, but just to be there to be a help in certain things, or just to support your husband. To us, that seemed very important. But some can't do that, and they have made it work. So.
You mentioned retirement, or you mentioned in the next 3 years it's going to be a greater exodus of pastors than perhaps ever. How does that affect your organization? Because you're trying to put energy back into churches. Are you experiencing a loss of leadership as well?
I was in a meeting Monday, and the placement guy said our bullpen is pretty thin right now.
Yeah.
Since I joined in 2008, I have observed that more of the interims want to limit how far they will go from home. When we joined, we were living in Burlington, Iowa, and so the first one that we did was in northern Iowa, 4 hours away, which is not too bad, but it still is quite a jaunt. The second one is Wilson, North Dakota, in the middle of an oil boom, and that was 14 hours away. And
We didn't come home, we didn't go back to our home often.
yeah, we had friends that took care of snow and mowing the yard.
Sort of.
You're kind of living as missionaries.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but it was rewarding to us to be able to be in a different culture. Just northern Iowa. I ran a 48-foot wide combine as we were harvesting
Durham wheat.
yeah. And so that was an interesting experience. In Williston, we learned all about oil production, a whole bunch about it. Not all
Not all
about
about
it.
it.
Yeah, but it was really an interesting time. go in between layers of rock and make an explosion and open it up so the oil will come out. And in Vermont, we learned a bunch about maple syrup harvesting. We learned a lot about the border. We were 4 miles from the Canadian border. And, although that was 2012 to 2014, the
Border Patrol was on their,
Yeah.
on the track.
and much to the distress of some of the people who lived on the border. So, a little town 4 miles from us was on the border. Their community building had a black line painted across the floor
No.
saying, "This is America, this is Canada." And when you park your car, the guy said, "No, you be sure you go out the way that you came in. Otherwise, when you get over to the customs office, they're gonna say, 'Why didn't you sign it?'" And you'd get in trouble.
But they had plays there, you could go in the American side, but you might be sitting in the Canadian side. And it was also a library, and so you could walk, around in there, but that was interesting.
So,
They had a street called Canusa, Canada and USA. And the border went right down the middle of that street. And you dare not step across that middle line of the road, the street, or you would be in Canada and you would be in trouble. It could be
yeah. So,
interesting.
quite interesting.
But now we love maple syrup. The real stuff that's expensive.
Yeah, a friend of ours this year had troubles that his yard was on the border and people one car got stuck in his backyard trying to get in the United States without staying on the road or going through customs.
Then they put barriers up and some trees and whatever, so, I mean, that border is also under attack.
Yeah. But it's so rewarding. I mean, phenomenal rewards we have felt by using our gifts in these years since we turned 65.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah, that was a long time. But lives that we have impacted, changes that we've seen in churches, it is very, very rewarding. Costly, yeah. You have to find a different car mechanic. If you stay there very long, you have to find different medical people. You have to make new friends, say goodbye to other friends. It's not cheap, but it's rewarding. So I encourage you to think about serving as an interim. And I encourage you to, if you just anybody that's in the church that they don't have a pastor, encourage them to get help. I think that's the biggest problem, that churches think they're just hiring another engineer or mechanic, and if they know what they're doing, that's great. But just because I know how to serve in a small church doesn't necessarily promise that I know how to serve in a small church in your community. So many differences.
A lot of different aspects of fitting the community
Yeah.
and choosing to become part of that community when you're interim, but also that helps you when you're helping a church call a pastor one church we were in, they called somebody from Florida to Williston, North Dakota.
Oh, boy.
And, you know, he had a few, he had a few issues there, so.
You followed him.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I'm currently serving in church, been there for 18 years, and eventually I'll get to the point of retirement sometime, but I'm curious to know, having done, I'm guessing, a couple of long-term pastorates, and then you moved into this season of your life where you're doing interim ministry. What lessons have you learned as an interim pastor that you wish you could have known when you were a long-term pastor that you could have applied?
I'll pay you later. That's a good question. One of the tools that we use as an interim is that we do individual interviews. And it's so helpful if in the first month, at the most 2 months, you interview, shall we say, 30 to 50% of the congregation with questions. With questions like, how did you accept Christ as Savior? When? Is there something about the church that makes you sad? Is there something about your church that makes you happy? Or you could put it another way. What is some event at your church that makes you very happy? Is a happy memory. But to be able to ask questions like that helps as an interim to really immediately get on board with people. One of the guys I'm coaching is in very early stages of that assignment, and he did 102 interviews. One of his questions was, who has the power in the church? And one guy's name was listed 63 times. Then,
And the second person.
and the second person was his brother. He was listed 29 times, I think it was.
Typically, is it still 1.5 to 2 years duration of most interims?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but by the changes you see, very rewarding.
And sometimes they're begging you to stay and you kind of have a commitment or an ethical piece of that says this is a 2-year commitment and then you must move on. Right?
Yeah.
It's contract.
We have a contract
Okay.
that says, I will not be a candidate for
Yeah.
the permanent pastor.
You can share why we didn't stay in Burlington, stay living in Burlington, why we
Yeah. We
went to Derby.
we planned to retire in Burlington, Iowa. I fixed up our home for long-term things, not short-term things. And when we were in Derby, Vermont, I followed a man who had been a pastor for 20 years. And he'd grown the church from about 175 to 40. And then, but he stayed in town. And the guy who preceded him had been there 20 years. So they had 2 pastors of 20 years each. And he was in town. And especially, not the second guy, but the first guy, he still wanted to be the unauthorized pastor of the church. And we began to realize, wait a minute, if we go back to Burlington, we can't go back as a friend. Because most people can't say the pastor is a friend, he's a pastor. I have people that I was their pastor back in the 70s, and they still, in email or social media, it's always Pastor Frank. You know, I stayed away long enough that I'm not trying to get any authority, but it's just as an interesting issue. And so as we looked at that, we realized we can't retire in Burlington. The church is having some struggles. And so.
And our property backed up pretty close to it wasn't backing up to church property per se,
Yeah.
but it was within
Very
a
close.
block.
Yeah. So I strongly advise pastors, when you leave a church, leave the community. Let the church function without you. Even if you see troubles, keep your nose out of it.
I think too that IPM has a great training,
Oh, yeah.
a lot of different, all those things that were up there, they really work hard on training you how to deal with those issues and
And
problems.
then every IPM pastor has a coach that you meet with them, Zoom or phone, once a week. So I told my guys I wasn't gonna be available today. I'm here.
Wednesdays he's coaching.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered what I want to say, unless somebody else has questions. Questions are very welcome.
Today or tomorrow. Okay.
So, I love interim pastor work, and just the ability to help the church see where they are. Interim pastors have developed a number of excellent tools. One is, and I don't know who the author of this is, but it's called Church, the life of a church. And it, one side of the hump is where you're growing, and the other side is where you're dying. And it's just a helpful diagram for a church to recognize, wait a minute, we're better described by the left side than by the right side. That's a big thing. Peacemaking is a big issue. I've used a number of peacemaking issued materials. There are other organizations that have done stuff on that, but for me, it has been very helpful. I appreciate the material that Peacemakers had a few years ago. I'm not sure if they still do or not, but they actually had like a 7-week sermon series on peacemaking related to forgiveness and acknowledging the need to make peace. Those are big issues that naive young kid, first church I pastored, I never noticed, and I can't remember how I discovered it, but two very, very active ladies in the church didn't talk to each other. And I said, well, what causes this? Well, the issue was, no, I'll just make up names. Sarah had her only child, and Mary, I don't know if she could cook at all. And there was a church potluck, and Sarah made a delicious pie, and there was one piece of pie left, and Mary's son took it, and her only child didn't get it. And so Sarah was very angry at her, and mean, this happened when they were young teenagers, and this is minimally 10 years later.
That's so important.
Yeah, because so many.
Like he wouldn't get more of those delicious pies his mother was gonna
I
make.
can just imagine Jesus, Matthew 5, preaching, blessed are those who don't take
The last
piece of
the last piece of pie.
Sarah. So, well, thank you for coming.
Frank, can I pray over you and
That would be
just,
wonderful.
what we're about to go do is go eat lunch. We'll talk about that here in a second. But I'll close our time in prayer.
Go ahead.
Lord, we lift up Frank to you. We're so thankful for this breakout session. God, thank you for the work that you've done in his life and in his family's lives. God, we know that it's not been easy. You did not call us to be in ministry, to do easy work. God, yet we are called to be with the brokenhearted, with those who are in broken families, dealing with sickness and disease and anger, God, with sadness, with emotions that we don't know what to do with, God. But God, you do know what to do with them. And for this season of interim, for churches that are dealing with that, God, we just pray that they cling to you in the uncertainty, God, that they're able to figure out what they can do well, and that they have advisors and counselors and people to pour into them so they can flourish and become healthy churches. God, we know that we can look to Jesus through all of this. Thank you for that connection that we have to you, and thank you for his sacrifice in order to restore this world. God, we know that we can't do it with our own strength and our own will, but through the power of the Holy Spirit. So we ask for the churches that are struggling right now to wonder what their next step might be, God, that you would give them the gift of your Holy Spirit to help them do things that are unimaginable. God, give them the people that need to give them advice and comfort and strength in order to take the next step. And God, as we think of pastors who are weary and tired, who are looking at retirement, who are thinking about leaving ministry, Lord, we pray a special blessing over them, that you can give them the encouragement that they need, and also the rearview mirror to look at who's maybe right behind them that needs to step into their shoes and how to help transitions go well. God, we know that you can be in the midst of all of that. So we look to you. We pray for those who are in that and who need the guidance. And God, thank you again for just the encouragement that Frank provided today. Lord, as we leave this room and we go about the rest of this conference and we head to lunch, God, we ask that you bless the foods to our bodies, that you bless the conversations that we're going to continue to have. And God, just restore our souls and bless our time here. And we pray all this in Jesus' name.